So I was recently listening to a couple of conversations pertaining to the philosophy of religion and the existence of God, and it just got me thinking more about why I think evolution provides a plausible explanation for certain things. One conversation was between David Baggett and William Lane Craig, and they were talking about the moral argument. Another conversation was Alex O'Connor talking to Ross Douthat, and they were talking more about the fine-tuning argument. And in both of these discussions, I just found myself thinking that evolution does describe why it is that these things occur or are the way that they are. So, for example, with the moral argument, obviously, David Baggett and William Lane Craig are Christian philosophers and apologists, and they're coming from a perspective of moral realism. So they believe that morals are an objective thing out in the world, and we just kind of discover them. And they believe that these objective ideas about morality come from a creator. So there is a divine being that whose nature reflects, or I should say, these moral objective values reflect the nature of this divine being who we call God. But I just think that there is an alternative explanation when we consider our moral evolutionary psychology. So the cognitive science of religion has helped us to understand enough to know that society has developed in such a way as to benefit the survival and thriving of groups of people. And so while it is true that we have this sort of foundational intuition that something like God exists, that is really more of a survival mechanism. And there are lots of ways that we work together in community to help each other survive. And so when we talk about reasons why certain things are bad, we believe that there are things that seem objectively wrong. It's because of what contributes to our thriving in society. So I think one very plausible basic definition of morality is simply whatever contributes to the survival and thriving of living beings, particularly conscious beings. And so when you talk about examples such as David Baggett and William Lane Craig discussed, everybody can kind of agree that torturing a baby specifically for fun, which is an interesting qualifier, which we can talk about later, but that is clearly just something that is wrong. And this is obviously because it doesn't contribute to the thriving of that creature. And pretty much anything that you discuss can go along these lines, that basic foundational principle of benefiting the living being, particularly these conscious beings. That's really all that you need to have an objective moral framework. And I think they might say that this sort of goes along the lines of a constructivist view, but it's somewhat different in the sense that it's not constructivist in a relative sense. You're not just, different societies don't just make up their own rules. All of society has developed, humanity has developed in such a way as to believe these foundational moral principles that contribute to our survival because of how we need to work together cooperatively. Now, one example that you might use to push back on this is, well, what about slavery? Slavery has always been a part of societies. It still is. And we've really disagreed on whether or not this is a good thing. And recently, you've got scholars like Bart Ehrman who have written on the fact that Jesus was, if not the only, at least one of the first pivotal proponents of this idea that it's not just our own tribe that we need to be caring for and we need to cooperate with, it's others. And we need to be able to sacrifice for the sake of the other. I think there is an argument to be made that this is just kind of the next step in our human evolution, recognizing that our tribe, aren't the only ones that need to survive and thrive, but we're recognizing that all tribes, even those over there, need to survive and thrive as well. And so we're kind of developing this understanding that we need to work not just for the benefit of our own tribe and community, but also for the benefit of other communities around us. And so there is, I think, a pretty solid description of how evolution brings us to the moral status that we have right now in our world. Very similarly, with the fine-tuning argument, and I think this one is an even stronger case for evolution. The point here is the idea of fine-tuning points to a creator because the world is organized and structured in such a way that it is extremely improbable that we could even exist and survive in any way. And the constants of the universe are so precise that if they were varied by just a little bit, the world couldn't exist as it does. But you can imagine that through some sort of evolutionary process of the universe, we don't have to develop to the point that we have right now. So, we think of we need oxygen to breathe. We need to be a certain distance away from the sun in order to survive, all kinds of things like this. These are, small examples of a much greater scale of understanding fine-tuning, but you can imagine that the world could have evolved in a different way. So whatever the parameters are of the universe, maybe life could have developed in that framework. So maybe we don't breathe oxygen, rather we breathe aluminum, or we're not carbon-based beings, rather we're argon-based beings, or protons, neutrons, and electrons and quarks aren't the things that make up the universe. There's something else that sort of makes up the universe. And perhaps we as living, existing beings could exist in entirely different states that we don't understand or recognize right now because the world is the way that it is. But survival could have developed in different contexts. And so, you can imagine maybe some sort of alien life form. Maybe we would be some sort of different type of alien life form rather than what we are now. Now, I think for both of these, the moral and the fine-tuning, you do push it back a little bit, and the question still stands, why exist at all? Why is existence a good thing? Why is it that conscious beings develop? So I don't think it's necessarily convincing that, the fine-tuning suggests that the world around us is developed so perfectly that we can exist. I think that if these constants had different values, a world could develop with different parameters. And for the moral argument, society has simply developed in whatever way is required for us to thrive, not just as individuals, but in communities. But yeah, why is it that survival is the good thing? Why is it that the universe pushes towards this consciousness or has this consciousness inherently? However you want to put it, I think that is still a fundamental question and one that is intriguing. Now, there, of course, are responses to this. It just is. The universe is eternal. It's just by necessity. It's just a brute fact. And those are debatable points. But at the very least, I do think that when we talk about things like morality and fine-tuning and others as well, evolution and this sort of mechanism that drives survival and living in our universe, I think that is a strong argument that at least doesn't require us to believe in a God. I don't think that it is sort of an obligation intellectually to believe that there was a divine creator for it. But it does push the conversation a bit further. And I'm really interested in responses to that and what some philosophical or maybe theological responses are to this evolutionary psychology and universal development evolutionary sort of thing. So yeah, go ahead and continue that conversation here. Let me know if that makes sense.